started. Okay, perfect. Okay, so here is the same disclaimer script from last time, which will happen at the beginning of every meeting that we have. So I'm communicating today in my official capacity on behalf of the FedRAMP Program Management Office at the General Services Administration. To ensure effective engagement and transparency with industry, I will be sharing information based on what I know at the present time. The information I plan to share today is provided to enhance transparency between industry and the FedRAMP PMO, but it is possible that some of this information may change at a later date because no final decisions have been made at this time. However, I think it is important to have this dialogue so we can move forward in a transparent manner, but I wanted you to have that context before I got into the substance of my presentation. My commitment to you is to continue this dialogue and share any new developments as soon as I can. Additionally, any reference in this conversation to any specific commercial product, process, or service, or the use of any trade, firm, or corporation name is for the information and convenience of the public and does not constitute endorsement, recommendation, or favoring by GSA. Okay, disclaimer over. Um, some short ground rules. We again have a lot of people registered for this meeting, so we've turned off the ability to unmute yourself so we don't have to chase down interruptions. And we've also disabled the in-meeting chat. We want all discussions and collaboration to take place in the GitHub discussions board created for this working group, and you can see the link to that on the board. And Dan, you can also paste the link into the chat if you want to. We invite you to post any questions or ideas you have on our discussions board. And we created a dedicated questions thread for this town hall, which is pinned in the board. So if you have any questions that may arise or anything that you would have typed in chat, feel free to type that in that thread. Awesome. We will also, again, be answering questions and engaging there. So with that being said, today's agenda, we're going to start by doing a recap of how we'll work, just so that any new visitors know what's going on. Then we'll go into a recap of some of the discussions that have been happening on GitHub, some of the big themes and questions that we've been seeing. And we're going to talk a little bit about how this is informing our work here at the FedRAMP PMO. Then we're going to talk about the anatomy of a KSI. You've probably heard us talk about KSIs a lot, but I feel like we haven't really concretely defined it yet. So we wanted to take a stab at that now, and then we'll get into some next steps. So with that, here's the recap of the how we'll work slide. Again, sorry for all the repeat information for those of you who are already here. Just want to make sure that everyone's caught up. So the intent is to meet bi-weekly for 30 minutes to an hour. These meetings are not intended to be utilized to collaboratively work on activities, gain consensus, or make decisions. These are solely touch points to provide updates on progress both within this group and the greater FedRAMP 20X community. The majority of the engagement and work in this group will be done in our GitHub repo discussion forum. The CWG is a new model for public-private collaboration, and one of our guiding principles is for all work to take place in public with maximum transparency. So working in GitHub discussions ensures all community members, present and future, will have access to our work. And myself and Dan will work to facilitate discussions, answer questions, and work through problems identified within the forum. Agenda recommendations will also happen there. So anything brought up in the town hall meetings will also be posted to GitHub. Otherwise, it may be forgotten. And so GitHub will be the primary hub for discussion and collaboration. These meetings are just to recap things. Perfect. I'll pass it off to Dan to give a GitHub recap.
Awesome. Thanks, Kylie. So first of all, I just really want to thank everyone for the very lively participation on the GitHub discussion board. As of yesterday, we had 13 individual like top level discussion threads. We had 84 comments on those threads and 135 replies to those comments over the last 2 weeks. We've also seen engagement from 60 unique users, which is just fantastic. I want to give a quick shout out to our top contributors for this 2 week period. You can see them there in the box in red. Thank you so much for your engagement. Community contributions are the special sauce that is going to make this program work. For anyone who wants to add to the conversation, the next 2 week period, FedRAMP wants to dive really deep into the technical specifics of different platforms and how to automate security validation. We'll talk more about that in the following slides, but if you're new here and want to participate, the link to our discussion board can be found on the screen here in the chat and also on our website. By participating in these chats, you're helping to contribute to the future of FedRAMP and providing input that will help to inform future FedRAMP standards, particularly for the 20X program. We've seen a lot of really interesting themes in the discussion, and we're really excited to see people sharing some sample code and structured data formats. We want to touch on just a few of the ideas that have come up. First, it's been said many times, many ways, system owners know best how to secure their systems. And this is exactly what the FedRAMP 20X program is all about. In the idea behind this program, in our vision, we, the federal government, are going to tell you, the CSP, what security issues are most important to us, the government, and then you, the CSP, tell us how you have addressed those concerns. This is the idea that's going to make that differentiates FedRAMP 20X from the things that we've done in the past. The second concept that we've seen several times is the need to avoid expense and effort of assessing the same thing over and over. These comments remind me of the try, don't repeat yourself principle of programming. When applied to security assessment, it kind of means that we, FedRAMP, need to provide a path for you to leverage compliance verification from other cloud providers to reduce the overall burden on each CSP. If your cloud host already has a way to validate that you are using encryption at rest, we don't want you to recreate that wheel. We want to leverage validations from the other CSP services that you're using to make this as simple and effective and inexpensive as possible. Next slide. Great. We also have heard a lot of concerns and questions about FedRAMP 20X, many concerns and many questions. Again, we'll just highlight a few examples that we can talk about. One common concern was that more complex systems are going to be exponentially more difficult to achieve the level of automation that we're looking for. A lot of people have brought this up. It's been part of many conversations, and we want to say, like, yes, just 100% understood. Our plan here is to start with the easy stuff, right? We're going to look at cloud native LI SaaS offerings hosted on a FedRAMP authorized PaaS or IaaS vendor. We want to start with something really simple, but we also want to avoid painting ourselves into a corner by building something that's just unworkable for the more complex systems, but just generally want to acknowledge that, yes, we understand that there are lots of edge cases and there are lots of more complex systems for which this is going to be a more complicated problem space to solve. But we still want to start with those easy kind of low-hanging fruit offerings to prove out the program and learn about what our challenges are going to be. Another common question that's come up was how do we, and I think in this case, we means both we, the government, and also other CSPs, trust and verify the information provided by a CSP. So as much for the CSPs that are leveraging other CSPs as it is for us, the government. And again, this is something we expect to evolve over time, right? In the traditional FedRAMP process, you have to remember everything had to be manually verified, usually several times. So achieving even a small kind of beachhead in automation is going to be a big step in the right direction. So again, we're going to start with low-hanging fruit, look at the things that we can easily automate, the things that we can easily automate the validation and evidence collection of, and look for continuous improvement on how we can make this better. Finally, and perhaps the most often asked question, what does all these automation and process change going to cost the CSPs? And I want to assure people this is definitely a first-class consideration as we move forward, right? The goal of the FedRAMP 20X program is to make things easier, cheaper, and faster for the CSPs. The good news is we've seen a lot of discussions about CSPs using automation internally for security validation. So we know again that there is low-hanging fruit out there, ways that we can make this happen. And we, as always, really welcome discussion in the GitHub discussion forum about both technical and business or financial challenges that these ideas may address. Nibrita. Back to you,
Awesome.
Kylie.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. So, as we've been mentioning, talking about the things that you put in the discussion board are giving us valuable ideas and information that are helping to inform our activities as a PMO in the development of 20X. So, some of the ideas we've heard include dynamic KSIs that allow maximum flexibility in implementation, reusable configurations that are assessed once, validated as secure, and then can be used by anyone, and also using cryptographic means to ensure the authenticity of evidence. So these are just some of the many ideas that were shared, and they're all factoring into our overall strategy. We also understand that there are concerns with the speed and scale of change happening at FedRAMP. And with our transition to automation, we've heard some questions raised, like Dan mentioned, about inadvertently raising the cost or that not all security evidence can be trusted. And we're trying to keep those concerns top of mind in our work moving forward. So, overall, you have given us confidence that our approach of designing and iterating on key security indicators is the right way forward for industry. So, because of this, the PMO is currently drafting a standard for low impact key security indicators. By starting with the low impact, we can mitigate those concerns about large, complex systems for now in favor of developing concepts and like the minimum viable 20x process that can then serve as a jumping off point for those more complex systems. So everyone will have the opportunity once we release our KSI draft, our key security indicator draft, to provide official feedback via the request for comment process. And you can find out when that gets posted because there will be a FedRAMP blog post about it. And I also will open a thread on our discussion board to let people know and foster informal discussion. But again, per FedRAMP statutory policy, official feedback will go through the request for comment process, but we want our community working group to be a place where informal discussions and ideation and prototyping around technical implementation happens. So with that being said, how will that affect our future engagement at this community working group? So, in the near to medium term, the Automating Assessment Working Group will be focusing on cross platform, trusted technical validation for the key security indicators. Obviously, we don't have the key security indicators out yet, but once they are released, we're looking forward to seeing engagement from this community on the development of prototypes, ideas for implementation on specific platforms, sample output or data generated from existing platforms as they relate to the KSIs, and discussions around which KSI validations are possible to automate today and validations that may need to be manually validated to start, as well as 3PAO engagement on all of this stuff. So I know that we have been talking a lot about key security indicators in this working group. I'm going to pass it off to Dan to break that down a little more and talk in more detail about how exactly we're going about the process of drafting them and sort of what they might end up looking like.
Thanks, Kylie. So yeah, we've recognized that we keep talking about KSIs But it might not be, if you haven't been part of the PMO for the last 2 months where we've just been talking about them nonstop, which obviously none of you are, there may be a lot of confusion around what really is a KSI. So I want to try and give some more concrete kind of background and examples. So first of all, there's been a lot of discussion about KSIs versus control families and how they map to NIST 853 controls. And as a PMO, we want to address that and say, like, when we're designing key security indicators, we're trying to maintain the spirit and intent behind the NIST 853 controls, but we will not be directly aligning with it because, in short, 853 controls are very complicated and in a lot of cases are not the best model for talking about the security of cloud-based systems. So let's delve into that a little bit more. So each control in NIST 853 was created to address a certain risk or risks. Often there are many controls across different control families that are addressing the same risk. You can see this when you look at 853 and you look at the often very lengthy list of related controls for every single other control in 853. Just for an example, let's talk about something like incident response. Right? When we talk about incident response, obviously you have all of the IR controls in the IR incident response family, but then you also have other controls like RA3 and RA5, which talk about risk assessment and vulnerability monitoring and scanning, right? That's a critical part of incident response because that's how you're identifying certain types of incidents have occurred. SI2 talks about flaw remediation, right? Which ties back into our incident response plan because it's how we respond to many types of incidents. And then you have things like CP family, where you have, CP2 is your contingency planning, CP10 defining recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives, CP9 system backups, and then you even have things like in the personnel security control family, right? PS8 talks about personnel sanctions and what do you do when you've identified an insider threat and how do you address that insider threat and how do you notify people about that insider threat? So you don't have to remember all those controls. Please don't worry. But it just gives you an example of how you can take a security concept or a security area, and it's going to map to a lot of different controls across a lot of different families. So part of the process with the KSIs is to try and kind of simplify this in a way to address the underlying goal of all of those NIST controls in a single consolidated response. So addressing all of those separate controls across all the different control families results in a lot of repeat documentation and necessitates a lot of narrative. That also makes more work for us, for the government, during the review process. So all this extra effort doesn't necessarily address the underlying risk behind incident response in this case or any other security area in the most efficient or accurate way. So the KSIs are going to try and help us find a new way to approach this. Okay, next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a KSI then, right? Specifically drafting, let's specifically talk about like if we were drafting an incident response KSI, and this is not saying this is a KSI, don't get ahead of us, right? But we'll be publishing a list of the initial LISAS KSIs. We start when we're talking about drafting a KSI though, right? We start by looking at what are the underlying risk factors? What are the risks here for incident response? Basically, incident response is talking about the risk that over time, the security of the system is going to change, even if no changes are made, right? Whether that is vulnerabilities in our third-party components or our service providers, it's external hackers attacking our site or DDoSing our site, things like that. Or it could be insider threats identified that are, invalidating some of our security controls by performing actions that are prohibited by our security policies. So the next thing we do is we say, okay, well, what do we want a system owner to do about these potential threats, about these potential risks? And there could be lots of things that a system owner could do to address these concerns. A couple of examples might be, number one, constantly monitoring and evaluating risk, right? Are you continuously looking at your systems to discover if there are new risks that have come that have been exposed or discovered? Making sure that you have plans for likely as well as unlikely events covering everything from routine patching to ransomware. What are you going to do in the event of those kinds of risks being discovered? And finally, demonstrate a history of addressing incidents promptly and effectively. So having plans is great, but we also want to see demonstrated effectiveness of those plans either through regular testing or through actual implementation or actual uses of those plans to address discovered threats. So when we're defining that KSI, right, we look at the risk and what kinds of security practices or objectives are going to address that risk. Then we look at which security controls address the same risk or security objectives, and that's where we end up creating a mapping from KSIs to NIST security controls. But we look to the CSP to be responsible for collecting, hopefully via automated means, and reporting evidence that, so reporting both what are you doing to address this risk and also evidence that demonstrates that you are doing the thing you say you're doing. So the validations are kind of the things you say you're doing, and then the evidence supports demonstrating that you are doing those things. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. When you're responding to a KSI, though, and this is really the kind of most important part of this, we don't want you to just respond to a list of related NIST controls, right? That's likely going to result in a lot of unnecessary work on your part and probably isn't going to produce the best value for the government. So instead of thinking of KSIs as we have typically looked at 853 controls as kind of a simple, you shall do this, you shall not do this, KSIs are best viewed as a list of values or goals that the government is expressing about the security of our systems, and then looking for the CSP to respond to that with evidence demonstrating how you are achieving those security goals and objectives. Okay, that was a lot of talking. Next slide. This one will be quicker, I promise. So let's just really briefly talk about the CSP validations, right? So the KSI defines some objective, right? And the CSP then responds with multiple validations demonstrating how the objective is achieved. So there may be some objectives, some validations that will be defined along with the KSI, but there's always the opportunity then for a vendor to add additional validations or for us to add additional validations in the future. So for example, let's say there's a KSI for identity and access management. What's the risk that we're addressing here, right? It's that unauthorized people are doing unauthorized things, right? That's the principal risk behind identity and access management. Our security objectives might be things like protecting user data, controlling access, and implementing zero trust practices, right? So a CSP could achieve those things by doing stuff like what's listed in this table, right? So we've got things like multi-factor authentication, secure API endpoints, and using least privilege role-based security. We also want the CSP to provide evidence, right? And the evidence can include things like a validation from their IDM, their identity management provider, or their key management service that shows, hey, this person has configured our service in a way that we've validated is compliant with the values that are expressed in this KSI. It could also be a SOC 2 or a 3PAO assessment where the assessor has documented compliant architecture or policies. So there can be both technical evidence, automated collection of evidence, but also we want there to be the option or the availability for manually validated evidence to be presented as well. We're going to delve more deeply into this over the next 2 weeks. We want to take 2 specific validations as samples, and we're going to really delve into the technical aspects and challenges that a CSP might face in these. So small deviation here, right? So in Agile, we sometimes use what's called a test bullet or a discovery sprint. And this is where a team will try and implement a very well-scoped set of features. And the purpose really is more so than implementing those features is to discover more about the challenges that they may face in future sprints, right? So it's kind of the the real purpose of the sprint is to kind of learn more about what the challenges in the particular system are going to be like, as opposed to actually successfully implementing those features. We want to do something kind of similar here. And the way we're going to approach that is we're going to focus in on two sample validations, right? So these would be responses from the CSP in response to certain KSIs. Specifically, we're interested in hearing from the working group on how a small, like LI SaaS company could report on these two specific validations, how we can automate these on major platforms, and how we create processes for 3PAOs or other auditors to assist in that verification. We want to hear your ideas around these two validations, and we've chosen one that's relatively simple and one that's a little bit more complex. We also want to focus on how CSP addresses these two samples without necessarily thinking about the larger picture of what KSI they might be a part of. So these are just very specific sample validations, and we want to focus on how would you respond to this particular validation as opposed to like what broader KSI it might be a part of or how you would respond to a broader KSI that included this. So our first sample is the easy one, maybe. And the question we're looking at is how do we ensure that phishing resistant MFA is enabled for users? What it is, LISAS, again, LISAS, small company, how can you demonstrate that and how can we validate it? The second example, the sample is maybe a little bit more complicated. How do we monitor system changes and ensure impacts on security are measured and addressed? So this one, the first one is a little bit easier to see from a technical perspective how I could validate it. The second one, there are certainly technical aspects to it that I should be able to validate, but also there's a lot of kind of policy and historical evidence that would be used to actually evaluate that. So if you're a CSP, we want to know how you measure these today, or how you could measure them. How do you monitor for this within your own organization? If you are an IaaS or a PaaS provider or a GRC tool vendor, we want to know how you can help your customers validate these or what evidence you can help provide that your customers are in fact complying with these validations. And if you're a 3PAO or another auditor, we want to hear from you as well. How do you validate these when you're reviewing a system, right? We're talking about automating assessment. How do you assess these today? Are there automated tools that you use or automated system checks that you can make? And how can you help your customer provide evidence that they are compliant here with in a machine readable format, as opposed to system assessment reports or SOC 2 reports, things like that. So just to restate one more time, the goal is to go super, super deep and technically specific on these two small areas. We are welcome code, sample output, and implementation ideas. We're going to have two discussion threads that have already been set up on the GitHub discussion board. And we really encourage the conversation to stay tight and scoped on the technical implementation details for each of these specific samples. If this sparks other broader questions, please feel free to start new threads. But the threads that we've set up should stay focused on the technical implementation details for these two examples. All right.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. I'm gonna like lightning through this because I know we're a little over time. So our next meeting will be held on the 30th of April at 1 p.m. If you registered through the formal Zoom channel, you should have the invites for all the next meetings. It's just the same link. And if you haven't formally registered, you should, because that will cover our bases in case anything happens. Also, if you're interested in bringing forward a topic, prototype, or idea, post in the discussion forum. Obviously not for product pitches, but we are interested in platforming code, prototypes, etc., related to the development of 20x. And thank you so much for coming. See you on GitHub.